A 13-year-old girl who hasn't slept indoors in 11 days finds a loaded handgun hidden behind a biker clubhouse. And the weapon isn't old, isn't forgotten, isn't lost. It's been planted, clean, deliberate, waiting for the wrong hands to touch it at exactly the right time. What she does next will either save the only people who ever showed her kindness or destroy them all. This is the story of Ava Mercer, the invisible girl who saw everything nobody wanted her to see. You're going to want to stay until the very end of this one. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from, and let's get into it. The last time Ava Mercer slept in a real bed was 19 days ago. She remembered because she'd counted. Not out of self-pity, she was past that. She counted because counting kept her brain busy during the hours between 2 and 5 a.m., when the cold stopped being uncomfortable and started being something else entirely. Something that crawled into your chest and made your breathing shallow. Something that whispered things about giving up. 19 days since the apartment on Ridgeline. 19 days since Carl had thrown a kitchen chair at her mother's back and then turned those bloodshot eyes toward Ava with something worse than anger. Something patient. Something that had been building for months. She'd climbed out the bathroom window that night wearing a hoodie 2 sizes too big, sneakers with no socks, and nothing in her pockets except a gas station lighter she'd found on the sidewalk 3 weeks earlier. No phone, no money, no plan. Just gone. Now she crouched behind a rusted commercial dumpster in the storage lot behind Henderson Avenue, pressing her spine against the cold metal and pulling a blue tarp tighter around her shoulders. October in Mill Haven was already brutal. The kind of cold that didn't announce itself. It just arrived one morning and stayed, settling into the pavement and the brick walls and the bones of anyone unlucky enough to be sleeping outside. Ava was unlucky enough. She exhaled slowly through her nose and watched her breath disappear. Across the lot, the back wall of the Iron Ridge Riders Clubhouse rose like a dark fortress. Windowless on this side, just weathered brick and a heavy steel door that she'd never seen anyone use. Yellow light leaked from around the building's front corners. She could hear the low rumble of a motorcycle engine somewhere on the other side. Then another. Then silence. She'd been sleeping in this lot for 4 nights now. Not because it was comfortable. The concrete was murder on her hip bones, and the dumpster smelled like motor oil and old rain. But because it was protected. The fence on 3 sides kept the wind from cutting straight through her, and the bikers, for whatever reason, never came back here after dark. The bikers. Ava had been watching them for weeks before she started sleeping behind their building. Not on purpose at first. She'd been drifting through Millhaven's east side looking for safe places to disappear into. Doorways, parking structures, the crawl space beneath the abandoned laundromat on Pine. And the clubhouse kept appearing in her orbit like some kind of gravitational center. The Iron Ridge Riders. She'd seen the patch on their cuts enough times to memorize the design without trying. A jagged mountain ridge with a single iron bolt driven through its peak. Below it, the letters IRR in block font. The town talked about them the way small towns talk about anything they don't understand, with suspicion dressed up as concern. Dangerous. Rough. Probably into something illegal. That's what the woman at the shelter intake desk had said when Ava mentioned she'd been sleeping near Henderson Avenue. Honey, those men are trouble. You stay away from that end of town. But the woman at the shelter intake desk had also told Ava there were no beds available, handed her a granola bar that was 3 months expired, and pointed her toward the door. The bikers, on the other hand, had done something different. It was 8 days ago. Ava had been sitting on the curb outside the gas station on 4th Street, hood up, arms wrapped around her knees, trying to stop shaking long enough to think clearly. A black pickup truck had pulled into the lot, and a man in a leather cut had climbed out. Tall, late 40s maybe. Gray threaded through a dark beard. He'd gone inside, come back out with a bag, and was halfway to his truck when he stopped, looked at her. Not the way most adults looked at her. Through her, past her, around her, but at her. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he walked over, crouched down so he was at her eye level, and set the bag on the curb beside her. Inside, a bottle of water, a turkey sandwich in plastic wrap, and a pair of wool socks still in the packaging. "It's going to freeze tonight," he said. His voice was low, calm, not gentle exactly, but steady in a way that reminded her of something she hadn't felt in years. You got somewhere to go? Ava had stared at the socks. New socks. Nobody had given her anything new in a long time. I'm fine, she said. He'd looked at her for another 3 seconds. She could feel him deciding something. Then he stood up, pulled a $20 bill from his wallet, and tucked it under the water bottle. Stay warm, he said, and left. She'd watched his truck pull onto Henderson Avenue and turn into the Iron Ridge lot. That was the night she started sleeping behind the clubhouse. Not because she trusted the bikers, she didn't trust anyone, but because a man who buys wool socks for a stranger probably isn't the kind of man who'd hurt a kid sleeping behind his building. Probably. Now, on her 4th night in the lot, Ava shifted her weight and felt something hard press against her knee and through the tarp. She froze. Slowly, she pulled the tarp back and looked down. She was sitting on a folded piece of canvas she hadn't noticed before, heavier than the other tarps she'd been using, darker in color, tucked against the base of the dumpster like it had been deliberately placed there. She pulled the canvas aside. Underneath, wrapped in a clear plastic bag and positioned flat against the concrete, was a handgun. Ava's heart slammed into the base of her throat. She jerked her hand back and pressed it against her chest, as if the gun might fire from proximity alone. For 10 seconds, she didn't breathe. Then she forced herself to look again. It was a pistol. Black. Compact. She didn't know guns, had never held one, never wanted to, but she knew enough to see that this one was wrong. The plastic bag was clean. Not weathered, not torn, not sun-bleached. The gun inside looked new, or at least recently cleaned, and the canvas covering it wasn't old storage material. It was the same type of tactical canvas she'd seen on the back of military trucks in movies. This gun hadn't been dropped here. It hadn't been forgotten. Someone had placed it, carefully, recently, and they'd hidden it in the one spot behind the Iron Ridge clubhouse where nobody would think to look. Unless you were a 13-year-old girl who'd been sleeping on the ground. Ava covered the gun with the canvas and pulled her tarp back over her legs. Her hands were shaking, and not from the cold. She pressed her palms flat against her thighs and stared at the brick wall of the clubhouse. Something was wrong here. Something bigger than a hidden weapon. She could feel it the same way she could feel weather changing. Not in her head, but in her chest, a tightening that meant pay attention. Something's coming. She didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, she'd moved her tarp to the far corner of the lot, away from the dumpster, away from the gun. She didn't touch it again, but she didn't stop thinking about it either. 3 days passed. Ava survived them the way she'd been surviving everything, by becoming invisible. She ate at the soup kitchen on Birch Street on the days it was open. She filled her water bottle at the park fountain before the city shut it off for winter. She washed her face in the restroom at the public library and sat in the back corner reading until the librarian started giving her looks that meant, you can't stay here forever. She could not stay anywhere forever. That was the fundamental law of Ava Mercer's existence. Every surface was temporary. Every roof was borrowed. Every pair of eyes that noticed her was a countdown to being told to move. But she kept coming back to the lot behind the clubhouse, and she kept watching. On the second day after finding the gun, she noticed something new. A black SUV with tinted windows parked on the street across from the clubhouse's front entrance. It sat there for 40 minutes. No one got in or out. Then it left. The next day, the same SUV appeared again, this time parked 2 blocks south, angled so its driver would have a direct line of sight to the clubhouse gate. On the third day, Ava was sitting on a bus bench half a block from the clubhouse, hood up, knees drawn to her chest, looking like any other homeless kid the city had trained itself not to see, when a man stepped out of the SUV. He was wrong in the same way the gun was wrong, too clean. His jacket was black, fitted, expensive looking. His boots were polished. His haircut was military short, and he moved with the controlled precision of someone trained to move that way. Not like the bikers, who carried their weight with a kind of worn looseness, but like a man who was always calculating distance and angle. He crossed the street, walked slowly past the front of the clubhouse, paused to look at the signage, then continued down the sidewalk. He didn't stop. He didn't take pictures. He didn't do anything that would register as suspicious to anyone who wasn't already suspicious. But Ava was already suspicious, because she'd spent the last year and a half learning to read body language the way other 13-year-olds learned algebra. When your stepfather's moods determined whether you ate dinner or got hit, you learned to watch. You learned to read the angle of a shoulder, the speed of a blink, The difference between a hand reaching for a glass and a hand reaching for something else. This man was surveilling the clubhouse. She was certain of it, and she was certain of something else. The gun behind the dumpster and this man in the black jacket were connected. She didn't know how yet, but the geometry was too clean. The timing was too tight. Something was being built around the Iron Ridge Riders, something precise and deliberate and dangerous, and nobody inside that clubhouse knew it was happening. On Thursday evening, Ava did something she hadn't done in months. She went somewhere on purpose. Not to find food, not to find shelter, not to escape, but to understand. The town hall meeting was held in the basement of the Millhaven Community Center, a squat brick building that smelled like floor wax and stale coffee. Ava slipped in through a side door and sat in the last row of folding chairs, wedged between an elderly woman with a cane and a man who smelled like cigarettes and laundry detergent. Nobody looked at her. She was exactly what she needed to be. No one. The room was half full. Maybe 60 people. A banner across the front read, "Millhaven Forward, Building Our Future Together." Behind a podium stood a man Ava had never seen before, but whose face she recognized from yard signs that had been appearing on every other lawn for the past month. Russell Graves. He was tall, broad-shouldered, mid-50s, with silver hair combed back from a tanned forehead and teeth so white they looked manufactured. He wore a navy blazer over an open-collared shirt, and he smiled the way people smile when they've practiced it in a mirror. Wide enough to seem warm, controlled enough to seem trustworthy. "Millhaven deserves better," he said into the microphone, and the room offered a scatter of applause. "This town has been held back for too long by elements that don't represent who we are. Organizations that operate outside the law, groups that intimidate our neighbors and lower our property values and make our streets feel unsafe." Ava felt her jaw tighten. He never said the name. He didn't have to. Everyone in the room knew who he was talking about. The Iron Ridge Riders, the bikers on Henderson Avenue, the men in leather cuts who rebuilt the playground at Garfield Park 3 summers ago, who ran a free oil change clinic for single mothers every spring, who showed up without being asked whenever a storm knocked out power on the east side. Graves talked about progress, about development, about a revitalization corridor that would bring new businesses and housing to the Henderson Avenue area. He showed slides, architectural renderings of condominiums and retail spaces, sleek and modern, full of people who looked nothing like anyone Ava had ever seen in Millhaven. And right in the center of every rendering, right where the Iron Ridge Clubhouse currently stood, was a glass-fronted mixed-use building with a rooftop garden. They wanted the land. The realization hit Ava like cold water. This wasn't about public safety. This wasn't about cleaning up the neighborhood. This was about property, real estate, money. And the only thing standing between Russell Graves and his glass-fronted future was a group of bikers who'd been on Henderson Avenue for decades. The gun made sense now. A weapon planted behind the clubhouse, an anonymous tip to police, a raid, evidence, arrests, the kind of headline that would make every voter in Millhaven nod and say, "See? We always knew they were dangerous," and then the land would be available. Ava sat in her folding chair and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time, not since the night her father died. Not fear, not sadness, rage. A clean, sharp, focused anger that cut through the fog of exhaustion and hunger and loneliness like a blade. These men had fed her, had given her socks and water and a $20 bill and never asked for anything in return, had never looked at her with pity or suspicion or that particular brand of adult discomfort that meant, "I don't want to deal with you." And someone was trying to destroy them. After the meeting, Ava stood outside the community center in the dark and watched Russell Graves shake hands with voters under the yellow glow of the entrance lights. A black SUV pulled up to the curb. The man in the fitted jacket, the same man she'd seen surveilling the clubhouse, stepped out, opened the rear door, and Graves climbed in. The door closed. The SUV pulled away. Ava stood there until the taillights disappeared around the corner on Pine Street. Then she walked back to the lot behind the clubhouse, crawled under her tarp, and lay awake until dawn. 4 more days passed, each one colder than the last. Ava watched the clubhouse from different angles, different positions, rotating her observation points the way she imagined a detective might. She saw the man in the fitted jacket twice more, once parked on Henderson, once walking the alley behind the lot where the gun was still hidden. She saw a second man she didn't recognize taking photographs of the clubhouse from a car parked on the cross street. She saw bikers come and go. She learned their patterns without trying. The older guys arrived in the morning, trucks and bikes filling the front lot by 9. The younger members came later in the afternoon. On Tuesday nights, the lights stayed on until past midnight, and she could hear muffled voices through the brick. Not yelling, not arguing, just the low rumble of men talking. On Friday morning, she saw the man who'd given her the socks. He pulled into the lot on a black Harley, swung his leg over the seat, and stood for a moment stretching his back. She was sitting on the bus bench across the street, and for a brief second he looked in her direction. She pulled her hood lower. He went inside. She had to tell someone. She knew that. The gun, the surveillance, Graves, the development plan, it was all connected, and it was all moving towards something that would end with handcuffs and headlines and the Iron Ridge riders losing everything. But telling someone meant being seen. It meant stepping out of the shadows she'd spent a year and a half perfecting. It meant trusting strangers with information that could get her noticed by people who clearly had money and power and the willingness to destroy lives for profit. Every survival instinct she'd developed screamed at her to stay invisible, to pack up her tarp, leave the lot, and find somewhere else to disappear. That was the smart move. That was the safe move. Her father would not have made the safe move. Marcus Mercer had been a welder at the shipyard in Garfield. Quiet man. Big hands. He read paperback westerns and made pancakes on Saturday mornings and had a laugh that sounded like gravel rolling downhill. He was walking home from a night shift when he heard a woman screaming inside a convenience store. He went in. The man with the knife turned around. Marcus stepped between them. He died on the floor of that store at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. The woman he saved sent flowers to the funeral. Ava's mother started drinking that same week. Ava had been 11 years old. She'd spent 2 years trying to understand why her father had walked into that store, why he hadn't kept walking, why he'd chosen a stranger's life over his own daughter's future. For a long time, she'd been angry about it, furious. She'd hated him for being brave because his bravery had left her alone. But sitting on that bus bench watching the Iron Ridge clubhouse, she finally understood something. Marcus Mercer didn't walk into that store because he wanted to die. He walked in because he couldn't walk past. Because some people are built in a way that won't let them turn away from someone else's trouble. It wasn't a choice. It was architecture. It was who he was down to the foundation. And Ava realized, with a heaviness that settled into her stomach like a stone, that she was built the same way. Sunday morning, 7:15. The sky was the color of dirty concrete, and the wind coming off the river carried the smell of frozen mud and diesel. Ava stood across the street from the Iron Ridge Riders Clubhouse and stared at the front door. It was a heavy wooden door, dark-stained, with a small window of frosted glass set into the upper panel. A hand-painted sign hung beside it, members only. Below that, in smaller letters she hadn't noticed before, community welcome, Wednesdays 6 to 8 p.m. She wasn't going to wait until Wednesday. Ava crossed the street. Her sneakers, the same ones she'd been wearing for 19 days, now stiff with dirt and cold, made no sound on the pavement. She reached the door, stopped, put her hand on the handle. The metal was ice cold. Her fingers were shaking. She could feel her heartbeat in her wrists, her neck, the backs of her knees. She pulled the door open and walked inside. The warmth hit her first, then the smell. Coffee, old leather, wood polish, and something underneath all of that. Something she couldn't name but that made her think of her father's workshop. The room was large and open, with a long bar along one wall, a pool table in the back corner, and a half-dozen mismatched tables scattered across a wooden floor that was scarred and darkened with decades of boot marks. 4 men sat at a table near the bar. 2 more stood by the pool table with cues in their hands. All of them turned to look at her at the same moment, and the silence that fell over the room was total. Ava stood in the doorway, 5'2", 91 pounds, wearing a hoodie that smelled like dumpster runoff, with dirt under her fingernails and dark circles carved under her eyes. "I need to talk to whoever's in charge," she said. Her voice didn't shake. She was surprised by that. One of the men at the table, thick-armed, bald, with a scar running from his left ear to his jawline, leaned back in his chair and looked at her with narrowed eyes. "Kid, this isn't a... Let her talk." The voice came from the end of the bar. The man who'd given her the sock stepped forward, coffee mug in hand, and looked at Ava with the same steady attention she remembered from the gas station. Up close, she could see the patch on his cut more clearly. President. Below it, his name. John Mercer. Mercer. The name hit her like a punch. Same as hers. She filed it away, said nothing. "Sit down," John said. "Not a command, an offer." He pulled a chair out from the nearest table and set his coffee mug down. Ava sat. Her legs were trembling, but the chair was solid beneath her, and the warmth of the room was already loosening the knot in her chest that had been tightening for days. "What's your name?" John asked. "Ava." "Ava what?" She hesitated. "Just Ava?" John studied her for a long moment. Then he sat down across from her and folded his hands on the table. The other men watched, but nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The room waited. "You said you need to talk," John said. "So talk." Ava took a breath. The words had been building in her for days, pressure behind a dam, and now that the dam had a crack, everything came through at once. She told him about sleeping in the lot behind the clubhouse, about finding the gun under the canvas, about the man in the fitted jacket and the black SUV, about the town hall meeting and Russell Graves and the development plan and the architectural renderings that showed a glass building where the clubhouse stood. She told him everything. And as she talked, she watched John's face. It didn't change, not once. No surprise, no anger, no disbelief. Just that same steady attention, those dark eyes absorbing every word like a man who'd spent a lifetime listening to things other people didn't want to hear. When she finished, the room was so quiet she could hear the coffee machine ticking behind the bar. John turned to the bald man with the scar. "Duke, back lot, check it." Duke was out of his chair and through the rear door before John finished the sentence. Then John looked back at Ava. "How long have you been sleeping outside?" "Doesn't matter." "It matters to me." Ava stared at the table. A long crack ran through the wood grain, dark with age. She traced it with her finger. 3 weeks, she said quietly. John didn't react, didn't flinch, didn't soften, didn't give her the look she'd been dreading, the look that meant pity, which in her experience was just another word for powerlessness. Instead, he stood up, walked behind the bar, and came back with a plate. 2 pieces of toast, butter, a glass of orange juice. He set it in front of her and sat back down. "Eat," he said, "then we'll figure this out." Ava picked up the toast. Her hand was shaking. She took a bite, and for a moment the warmth of the bread and the taste of butter were so overwhelming that her vision blurred. She blinked hard and kept chewing. The rear door opened. Duke came back in. He was holding a clear plastic bag with a black pistol inside, gripping it through the bag so his prints wouldn't touch it. He set it on the bar without a word and looked at John. "Planted," Duke said. "Canvas wrap, fresh placement, no weathering on the bag." John nodded slowly. "John?" Duke's voice dropped lower. "That's a department-issue Glock. Serial's intact." The room went very still. Ava looked from Duke to John and saw something pass between them. Not words, not a signal, but a recognition. A shared understanding of what a police-issue weapon, planted behind their clubhouse with its serial number deliberately left traceable, would mean if it were found by anyone wearing a badge. It would mean evidence. It would mean a raid. It would mean every headline Russell Graves could ever want. John picked up his phone and dialed. 1 ring, 2. "Carla," he said, "I need you at the clubhouse, now. Bring your badge and don't tell anyone where you're going." He paused. "Because someone just tried to end us, and a 13-year-old girl is the only reason it didn't work." He hung up and looked at Ava. "You walked in here knowing what could happen to you," he said, "knowing the kind of people who planted that weapon. Why?" Ava set the toast down. She looked at John Mercer, president of the Iron Ridge Riders, a man whose last name matched hers for reasons she didn't understand, and said the truest thing she'd said in years. "Because you gave me socks, and nobody gives you anything." John held her gaze. Something shifted in his face, not softening, not breaking, but settling, like a door that had been locked for years finding its key. "Carla's a detective," he said. "Good one. She'll want to hear everything you told me. After that, we're going to need your eyes again. You see things other people don't." "I know," Ava said. "There's something else." John leaned forward, and for the first time his voice carried an edge. Not anger, but weight. The weight of something unsaid. "You said your last name is just Ava, but I heard you hesitate." Ava's fingers tightened around the glass of orange juice. "Your last name is Mercer," John said. "It wasn't a question. I've been looking for you for 2 years." The glass slipped. Orange juice spread across the table in a slow tide, and Ava sat frozen, staring at the man across from her. The man who shared her father's name, her father's steady voice, her father's way of looking at people like they were worth seeing. Outside, the rumble of a motorcycle engine broke the silence. Then another. Then a third. Through the frosted glass of the front door, Ava could see shadows arriving. And somewhere across Millhaven, in a campaign office with Russell Graves' name on the door, a phone was ringing. The orange juice dripped off the edge of the table and hit the wooden floor in a rhythm that sounded like a clock running out of time. Ava didn't move. Couldn't move. The words John had spoken were still hanging in the air between them, heavy, impossible, rearranging everything she thought she knew about her own life. "I've been looking for you for 2 years." "That's not," she started. "My brother's name was Marcus," John said. "Marcus David Mercer, welder, Garfield Shipyard, killed in a convenience store robbery 18 months ago protecting a woman he'd never met. He had a daughter named Ava, 11 years old at the time. After he died, his wife, your mother, moved in with a man named Carl Redding. I tried to find you both. Your mother changed her phone number, changed addresses 3 times, stopped returning calls from anyone connected to the Mercer family." Each sentence landed like a nail being driven into the floor. Precise. Final. "I don't have an uncle," Ava whispered. "You do." John's hands were flat on the table, fingers spread, the way a man holds himself still when everything inside him is moving. "Marcus and I hadn't spoken in 6 years before he died. That was my fault, not his, mine. And by the time I found out what happened, you were already gone." Ava stared at his face and searched for her father in it. The jawline, similar but harder, more angular, carved by years of weather and decisions that left marks. The eyes, the same dark brown, but where Marcus Mercer's eyes had carried warmth like a banked fire, John's carried something else, something that had seen the warmth and watched it go out and learned to function in the cold. "Why didn't you talk to him?" Ava asked. John didn't answer immediately. He picked up a napkin from the table and began wiping the spilled juice, slow and deliberate, as if the act of cleaning gave him time to choose his words. "Because I made a choice 20 years ago that your father couldn't forgive," he said. And he was right not to. The rear door opened. Duke came back in, this time followed by a woman Ava hadn't seen before. Tall, mid-40s, dark hair pulled back tight, wearing jeans and a gray jacket that didn't hide the badge clipped to her belt. She moved through the room with the kind of authority that didn't need announcing. Her eyes found Ava immediately, and Ava felt herself being assessed, not with suspicion, but with the clinical attention of someone trained to read damage. "Carla Brown," the woman said, pulling a chair to the table without waiting for an invitation. "Millhaven PD, Homicide Division, but I owe John a favor that I'll apparently be paying off for the rest of my natural life." She looked at John. "The gun?" "Bar," Duke said from across the room. "Bagged. Didn't touch it." Carla crossed to the bar, examined the weapon through the plastic without picking it up, and was quiet for a long time. When she came back, the professional calm in her expression had thinned at the edges. "That's a Glock 19, she said. "Standard department issue. If I run that serial, and I'm going to run that serial, it's going to trace back to either an active officer's inventory or a weapon reported stolen from evidence lockup." She sat down and looked directly at Ava. "Tell me everything. Start from the beginning. Don't skip anything, even if you think it's not important." So Ava told it again. The storage lot, the canvas, the clean plastic bag, the man in the fitted jacket, the black SUV, the town hall meeting, Russell Graves, the development renderings. Everything she'd been carrying alone for days, she laid on the table between the detective's folded hands and John's unreadable face. Carla took notes on a small pad. When Ava finished, the detective tapped her pen against the paper 3 times and looked at John. "If this is what it looks like," Carla said, "someone with access to police inventory planted a traceable weapon on your property to manufacture probable cause for a raid. That's not a local play. That takes connections inside the department, possibly the prosecutor's office." "Graves has those connections," John said. "Graves is a city council candidate with a real estate background and a donor list I'd need a subpoena to see." Carla leaned back. "What I'm saying is, this isn't one guy with a grudge. If this girl is right, and the gun suggests she is, this is coordinated, multi-layer, and you're not just fighting a politician, you're fighting whatever system he's plugged into." The room absorbed that in silence. "So what do we do?" Duke asked from his position against the wall, arms crossed, the scar on his jaw catching the overhead light. "We build a case," Carla said, quietly. "I can run the serial off the books, pull traffic cam footage from Henderson Avenue for the last 2 weeks, see if that SUV shows up. But I need time, and I need you to not do anything stupid." She was looking at John when she said that last part. Something old and complicated passed between them, the residue of a history that Ava couldn't read but could feel, like heat from a fire in another room. "We don't do stupid," John said. "You did Barstow," Carla said. The temperature in the room dropped. Duke uncrossed his arms. One of the younger bikers near the pool table shifted his weight and looked at the floor. John's jaw tightened. A small movement, barely visible, but Ava caught it because she'd spent her life catching small movements. "That was 7 years ago," John said, "and it's still the first thing that comes up when anyone runs the Iron Ridge Riders through any database." Carla's voice was flat, factual, and merciless. 3 members arrested, 1 convicted, property damage charges. An assault charge that got pled down. You want to know why someone like Graves thinks he can frame you and the public will buy it? Because Barstow gave them the story they needed. 1 incident, 7 years, and it's still the headline. John said nothing. Ava looked at him and saw something she recognized. The specific stillness of a man being hit with a truth he already knew, absorbing the blow without flinching because flinching would mean admitting how much it hurt. "I'm not bringing it up to punish you," Carla said, softer now. "I'm bringing it up because when this goes public, and it will go public, Graves' people are going to use it. Every reporter who covers this story is going to lead with Barstow. And if any of your guys so much as raise their voice between now and then, you hand them the narrative." "Understood," John said. Carla turned to Ava. "You. Where are you sleeping tonight?" "I'm fine." "That's not what I asked." Ava felt the walls going up. The automatic defense system she'd built from months of social workers and shelter volunteers and teachers who asked questions that led to phone calls that led to nothing. Every adult who'd ever asked where she was sleeping had used the answer to put her somewhere worse. "She's staying here," John said. Ava looked at him sharply. "I didn't say—" "There's a room upstairs," John continued, not to Ava but to Carla. "Storage room. We'll clear it out. Put a cot in there. She stays in the building until this is resolved." "John," Carla's voice carried a warning, "you can't just take in a minor without—" "I'm her uncle." The word landed in the room like a stone in still water. Carla's pen stopped moving. She looked at John, then at Ava, then back at John. "Since when?" "Since the day she was born. I just didn't earn it until now." Carla stared at him for a long time. Then she closed her notepad and stood up. "I'll need documentation. And I'll need to make some calls that won't go through official channels. You have 48 hours before I have to report this through proper custody procedures." She pointed her pen at John. 48 hours. Don't make me regret this." She left through the front door. The sound of her car starting cut through the quiet, then faded down Henderson Avenue. John looked at Ava. "You don't have to stay." "I know. But I'd like you to." Ava studied the crack in the table again. The wood grain was dark with years of spilled coffee and cigarette burns and the oil from hundreds of hands. This table had held weight before. It could hold hers. "Okay," she said. The room upstairs was small, narrow, with a single window that looked out over the back lot where she'd been sleeping. Duke and a younger member named Roach, wiry, early 30s, with tattoo sleeves and a nervous energy that made him seem like he was always on the edge of saying something he'd regret, carried out boxes of old parts catalogs and stacked oil filters, while Ava stood in the doorway and watched. Roach dropped a box on his foot, swore, and looked at Ava like he'd just remembered she was 13. "Sorry," he muttered. "I've heard worse," she said. He stared at her for a second, then laughed, a short, surprised sound, and went back to moving boxes. By evening, the room had a cot with a sleeping bag, a folding chair, a lamp with a crooked shade, and a small electric heater that hummed in the corner like a mechanical heartbeat. It was the most private space Ava had occupied in nearly a month. She sat on the edge of the cot and pressed her palms against the sleeping bag, and felt something crack inside her chest. Not breaking, but thawing. A thin layer of ice she'd built to keep functioning, giving way to something warmer and more dangerous underneath. She pressed her teeth together hard until the feeling passed. Downstairs, the clubhouse filled with bodies as evening arrived. Ava could hear them through the floor, boots on wood, the scrape of chairs, low voices threading into each other like the rumble of engines idling. She came down the stairs slowly and stood at the bottom, watching. There were maybe 15 men in the room now. Some she'd seen before. Others were new. Faces she hadn't cataloged, cuts with patches she hadn't memorized. The air was thick with coffee steam and the sweet, sharp smell of leather conditioner. Someone had turned on a radio behind the bar, low enough to be background, playing something with heavy bass and slide guitar. John stood at the center of the room. He'd been talking. She could tell by the way the silence was shaped around him, the specific quality of attention that meant people had been listening and were now processing. "And that's where we are," he was saying. "Carla's running the serial. We sit tight. We watch. Nobody moves on graves. Nobody talks to press. Nobody does anything that gives them ammunition." A man near the back wall spoke up. Ava hadn't seen him before. Tall, lean, late 50s, with a graying ponytail and eyes that seemed to evaluate everything in the room from a position of permanent skepticism. His cut read, "Vice President," and below that, the name Coyote. "And the girl?" Coyote said. The way he said it, "the girl," made Ava's shoulders tighten. Not hostile, but not warm either. The tone of a man who dealt in risk assessment and had just identified a new variable. "What about her?" John said. "She's a 13-year-old homeless kid who walked in off the street and told us exactly what we needed to hear at exactly the right time." Coyote pushed off the wall and took 2 steps into the room. "I'm not saying she's wrong. I'm saying the timing is convenient. She found the gun, Coyote. She says she found the gun. And now she's sleeping upstairs in our building, and a detective is running an off-books investigation based on her word." He looked at Ava directly for the first time. "No offense, kid, but I've been doing this too long to trust anything that falls into my lap gift-wrapped." Ava felt the room shift. Some of the men were nodding. Small movements, barely perceptible, but enough. Coyote wasn't alone in his suspicion. "She's my niece," John said. Coyote's expression didn't change. "That makes it worse, not better. When's the last time you saw her? Before last week?" "That's not relevant." "It's the most relevant thing in this room." Coyote's voice stayed level, controlled, but there was steel underneath it. "You've got a personal connection to the one person who brings us intelligence on a threat we didn't know existed. Any prosecutor worth a damn would call that manufactured. And if Graves' people find out she's family, if they find out you've got a personal stake in protecting her story, they'll flip the whole narrative. Uncle hides runaway niece in clubhouse, coaches her testimony, plants gun himself to create false flag. You want to talk about ammunition, John? You just loaded their gun for them." The silence that followed was different from the one that had preceded it. Thinner, more dangerous. The kind of silence that happens when someone says something that can't be unsaid, and everyone in the room knows it's at least partially true. John's hands were at his sides. His fingers curled slowly into fists, then released. Ava watched the tendons in his forearms shift beneath the skin. "She stays," John said. "I'm not saying she goes. I'm saying you need to think about what this looks like from the outside, because the outside is where the fight is going to happen. I've thought about it. Have you? Coyote took another step forward. Or have you been thinking about Marcus? The name hit the room like a detonation. Several men looked away. Roach, standing near the stairs, shifted his weight and stared at the floor. Duke, who was leaning against the bar with his massive arms folded, closed his eyes briefly and exhaled through his nose. John looked at Coyote with an expression that Ava couldn't read. Not anger, not pain, but something that contained both and was older than either. A wound that had calcified into something harder than bone. Careful, John said. Someone has to say it. Coyote didn't back down. You haven't been right about anything involving your brother since before Barstow. You carry that guilt like a goddamn anchor, and now his daughter walks through the door, and suddenly you're making decisions with your chest instead of your head. I've watched you lead this club for 11 years. You're the best president we've ever had. But right now, you're compromised. Ava stood at the bottom of the stairs and felt the room dividing around her. Not cleanly. There were no sides, no factions forming, but the doubt was spreading like cold air through a cracked window. She could see it in the way men avoided looking at John, in the way their weight shifted, in the imperceptible recalibration of loyalty that happens when someone you trust says something you've been thinking but were afraid to voice. She should say something, she knew that, but her voice was trapped behind a wall of something she couldn't name. Shame, maybe, or the old familiar terror of being the reason things fell apart. She'd been the reason her mother fell apart. She'd been the reason Carl's anger had a target. And now she was the reason 15 men in a room were questioning the judgment of the one person who'd shown her kindness. The pattern was always the same. Ava arrived and things broke. I'll leave, she said. Every head in the room turned to her. I'll go. I can write down everything I saw. Dates, times, descriptions. The gun's already here. You don't need me. John opened his mouth to speak, but it was Duke who moved first. The big man pushed off the bar, crossed the room in 4 strides, and stood in front of Ava with his arms still folded. Up close, the scar on his jaw looked like a river on a map, jagged, deep, telling a story she'd never hear. Nobody's going anywhere, Duke said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Coyote's right about the optics, John's right about the girl. Both things can be true at the same time, and if this club can't hold 2 truths in the same room, we've got bigger problems than Russell Graves. He looked at Coyote. You want to protect the club. Good. That's your job. But protection doesn't mean pushing out the one person who saw the threat coming. It means figuring out how to use what she knows without exposing her or us. He looked at John. And you need to tell her the rest, all of it, not just the socks and the brotherhood and the uncle routine. She deserves to know what Barstow was, what you did, what it cost. Because if she's going to stand next to this club, she needs to know what she's standing next to. The room held its breath. John looked at Duke for a long time. Then he nodded, once, slowly, and sat down at the table where the orange juice stain was still drying. Sit down, Ava, he said. She sat. 7 years ago, John began, and his voice had changed, lower, rougher, like something being dragged across gravel. A member of this club named Pete Landon got into trouble with a contractor in Barstow who was running unlicensed demolition jobs using undocumented workers. One of those workers got killed when a wall collapsed. Pete found out about it. He wanted to go public. The contractor sent people to shut him up. John paused. He picked up his coffee mug, looked at it, set it back down. We went to Barstow, 8 of us. The plan was to confront the contractor, get documentation, hand it to a reporter. That was the plan. He stared at the mug. What happened was different. The contractor had security, armed. Pete lost his temper. Things escalated. By the end of the night, 2 of the security guys were in the hospital. Pete was in handcuffs, and the contractor's office was on fire. The wall collapse was real, Duke said quietly. The worker who died was real. His name was Emilio. He was 23. And nobody ever heard about Emilio, John said. Because the only story that came out of Barstow was bikers starting fights and burning buildings. We handed them the headline. We were right about the contractor and wrong about everything else. He looked at Ava. Your father called me the next morning. He'd seen it on the news. He said, you want to be a hero, but you don't know how to be one without breaking something. He said, I can't have my daughter near that. And he was right, so he cut me off, changed his number, moved your mother to a new apartment, and I let him, because I didn't have a single argument that could beat the truth. The electric heater upstairs hummed through the floorboards. Somewhere outside, a Harley engine turned over and idled, its low growl vibrating through the walls like a second heartbeat. 2 years later, Marcus walked into a convenience store and died protecting a stranger, John said. And I didn't find out for 3 days. 3 days. My brother was dead for 3 days before anyone thought to tell me, because he'd made sure nobody in his life had my number. Ava felt the tears coming and clenched her jaw against them. Not now. Not here. She could feel 15 men watching her, and she would not give them the image of a crying child. She was not a child. She hadn't been a child since the night her mother stopped being her mother. So that's Barstow, John said. That's what Coyote's worried about. And he should be worried, because every mistake I made 7 years ago is still standing in this room like furniture nobody wants to move. Coyote, from his position against the wall, said nothing. His expression had shifted, not softened, but recalibrated. The look of a man who'd needed the truth spoken aloud and was now reckoning with the weight of having demanded it. I'm not leaving, Ava said. John looked at her. You made mistakes. My dad made mistakes. My mom made mistakes. Everybody in this room has made mistakes. She pressed her palms flat on the table, the same gesture she'd seen John make, and she didn't know if she'd learned it from watching him or if it was something deeper, something genetic, something Mercer. But right now, someone is trying to destroy the only people who gave me food when I was starving. And I saw it happening. I'm the witness. If I leave, you lose the one thing Graves doesn't know about. She looked at Coyote. You're right that the timing looks convenient. You're right that a prosecutor could flip the narrative. But you're wrong about one thing. Her voice was steady, clear, carrying a weight that no 13-year-old voice should have to carry, but that hers carried anyway, because the world had made her carry it. Nobody coached me. Nobody sent me. I've been invisible for 1.5 years. Nobody sees me. Nobody notices me. That's exactly why I saw what I saw. And that's exactly why Graves doesn't know I exist. The room was silent for 10 full seconds. Then Duke laughed, a single low, genuine sound that broke the tension like a stone through glass. She's a Mercer, he said. That settles it. Coyote looked at Ava for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he reached into his cut, pulled out a cigarette, and put it between his lips without lighting it. Fine, he said. She stays, but John... He pointed the unlit cigarette at the president. You report to the table, not the other way around. Every move goes through a vote. Every decision gets checked. If I think your judgment is clouded, I pull the emergency brake. Agreed? Agreed, John said. Ava exhaled. She hadn't realized she'd been holding her breath. That night, she lay on the cot in the upstairs room and listened to the building settle around her, the creak of old wood, the distant murmur of voices below, the occasional rumble of an engine outside as the last members left for the night. Her phone. She didn't have a phone. She hadn't had one in months, but the silence filled the same space a phone would have, a constant companion that asked questions she couldn't answer. Who was her father, really? Not the man she remembered, the pancake maker, the paperback reader, the quiet welder who came home smelling like metal shavings, but the whole man, the man who had a brother he'd cut out of his life, the man who'd made a choice about protection that meant Ava grew up not knowing she had family. And who was John? The man who'd gone to Barstow with fire in his chest and come home with ashes. The man who'd spent 2 years looking for a niece he'd never been allowed to know. The man who bought socks for strangers. She turned onto her side and looked out the window. The backlot was empty now. Just concrete and shadows, and the place where she'd slept for 4 nights without knowing that the building she leaned against belonged to her blood. Her eyes drifted to the spot where the gun had been. The canvas was gone. The weapon was downstairs, bagged and waiting for a detective who was running serial numbers off the books. And somewhere in Mill Haven, the man in the fitted jacket was still watching, still calculating, still building whatever Russell Graves was paying him to build. Ava closed her eyes. Sleep didn't come. Instead, something else arrived, a clarity she hadn't felt in months, cold and sharp and absolute. She was done disappearing, done being invisible. done being the girl who watched from the margins while the world broke things around her. Tomorrow she would start watching differently, not to survive, to fight. Her phone. She didn't have a phone, but somewhere downstairs John Mercer was still awake, sitting at the table where her spilled orange juice was now dry, staring at the door his brother's daughter had walked through, and his phone was ringing. He picked it up, listened. His face didn't change, but his hand tightened around the mug until his knuckles went white. "Say that again," he said. The voice on the other end spoke. John stood up slowly. The way a man stands when the ground beneath him has shifted and he needs to test whether it will hold. "When?" he asked. More words. John closed his eyes. "How many?" Silence. He set the phone down and looked at Duke, who was still cleaning glasses behind the bar. "That was Carla," John said. "The serial came back. The gun isn't from evidence lockup. It's from an active duty officer's personal inventory. An officer who filed a stolen weapon report 3 days ago." He paused. "The officer is assigned to the gang task force, the same task force that Graves' campaign donated $50,000 to last quarter through a community safety pack." Duke set the glass down slowly. "There's more," John said. "Carla pulled the traffic cam footage from Henderson. The SUV that Ava described has been circling this block for 3 weeks. Same plates every time. The vehicle is registered to a private security firm called Ashcroft Partners." He looked at Duke with an expression that was no longer calm, no longer controlled, but something raw and electric and dangerous. "Ashcroft Partners' largest client is Graves Development Group." The glass Duke had set down tipped off the edge of the bar and shattered on the floor. Neither man moved. "They're not just coming for the clubhouse," John said quietly. "Carla found a second stolen weapon report. Filed yesterday. Same task force officer. A different gun." Duke's voice was barely above a whisper. "Where?" "That's the problem," John said. "She doesn't know. Which means there's another planted weapon out there somewhere. And this time, we don't have a 13-year-old girl to find it before they call in the raid." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows of the old building. Upstairs, Ava lay on her cot with her eyes open, listening to sounds she couldn't quite identify. The muffled urgency of voices below, the tone of something going wrong. She didn't know yet what had been said. She didn't know about the second gun, or the task force connection, or the security firm with Russell Graves' fingerprints all over it. But she knew something had changed. She could feel it in the building, a vibration beneath the floorboards, like an engine revving before a long and violent ride. And she knew, with the certainty of someone who had spent her entire life reading The Architecture of Danger, that the war for the Iron Ridge Riders had just begun, and that the next move belonged to whoever found the second weapon first. Ava was already awake when the footsteps came up the stairs. She'd been lying on the cot for 2 hours, staring at the ceiling, listening to the muffled urgency below. John's voice, Duke's voice, the occasional sharp sound of a palm hitting a table. She couldn't make out words, but she didn't need to. She'd spent enough of her life listening through walls to know when a conversation crossed the line from concern into fear. The knock on the door was 2 taps. Fast. Duke's knock. She'd already learned it. "Kid, downstairs, now." She was on her feet before the second word. She pulled her hoodie over her head, shoved her feet into sneakers without tying them, and opened the door. Duke's face in the hallway light was different from anything she'd seen on him before. The calm authority was still there, but underneath it was something compressed. The look of a man holding a grenade and trying to figure out where to throw it. "What happened?" she asked. "John will tell you." Downstairs, the clubhouse looked like a war room. The pool table had been covered with a sheet of plywood, and on top of it were spread photographs, printed pages, and a laptop showing grainy traffic camera stills. John stood at the head of this improvised command center, phone in his hand, his face carrying the particular exhaustion of a man who hadn't slept and had stopped pretending he might. Coyote leaned against the far wall with a cigarette between his fingers, lit this time, the smoke curling up into the overhead light in slow spirals. Roach sat on a bar stool near the door, one leg bouncing with nervous energy, his eyes moving between John and the photographs on the table. And there was someone new. A woman Ava hadn't seen before, sitting in the corner booth with a laptop open in front of her. Late 30s, short black hair, wire-rimmed glasses, wearing a flannel shirt over a thermal. No leather cut. No club affiliation that Ava could see. But the way the men in the room oriented around her, not deferentially, but with the careful attention people give to someone who knows things they need to know, told Ava this woman was important. "Ava," John said, "sit down." She sat. The toast plate from the previous morning was still on the table, pushed to one side. Nobody had cleaned it up. Nobody was thinking about toast. "Carla called back an hour ago," John said. "The second gun hasn't been found. She's been running the plates on the SUV, cross-referencing Ashcroft Partners employee records, pulling every thread she can reach without triggering an internal alert." He paused, rubbed his eyes with the heels of his hands. "She found something she wasn't looking for." He turned to the woman in the corner booth. "Tell her." The woman closed her laptop partially and looked at Ava with an expression that was neither warm nor cold, professional in a way that reminded Ava of Carla, but without the badge, more like a surgeon assessing where to cut. "My name is Wendy Tran," she said. "I'm a forensic accountant. I do contract work for defense attorneys and occasionally for organizations that can't afford the kind of attention that comes with hiring a big firm." She glanced at John. "I've done work for the writers before. Off the books." "What kind of work?" Ava asked. "The kind where someone needs to prove that money went where it shouldn't have gone." Wendy pushed her glasses up her nose. "John called me tonight because Detective Brown found a financial connection she couldn't trace through law enforcement channels without a warrant. And she can't get a warrant without exposing her off-books investigation." "What connection?" Wendy turned her laptop so Ava could see the screen. Columns of numbers, company names, dates. A spreadsheet that looked like a foreign language. "Graves Development Group has 7 subsidiary LLCs," Wendy said. "Shell companies. Each one was created within the last 18 months. They're layered. Company A owns Company B, which owns Company C, which holds the actual assets. Standard obfuscation for a developer trying to buy property without anyone knowing who's really buying." "Property here?" Ava asked. "On Henderson?" "Not just Henderson." Wendy scrolled down. 4 blocks of Henderson Avenue, 2 blocks of Pine Street, the empty lot on Birch, where the old lumberyard used to be. And this is the part that matters, the building that currently houses the Millhaven Community Center. Ava felt something cold move through her chest. The community center, where the town hall meeting was. The same one. Graves' campaign held their event in a building that one of his own shell companies is already in negotiations to purchase. The seller is the city of Millhaven, represented by the City Property Commission, whose chair is a man named Dennis Felt. Wendy paused. "Let the name hang." "Who's Dennis Felt?" Ava asked. "Dennis Felt," John said from across the room, and his voice had the quality of a man reading an obituary, "was my platoon sergeant in Fallujah. We served together for 14 months. After we came home, he went into city government. I went into the club. We stayed in touch for a few years. Then we didn't." The room absorbed this. Coyote's cigarette had burned down to the filter. He crushed it in an ashtray on the windowsill and immediately pulled out another one. "What are you saying?" Ava asked, looking between John and Wendy. "That someone John served with is helping Graves buy up the neighborhood?" "I'm saying it's more complicated than that," Wendy said. Felt's commission approved 3 below-market property sales to Graves' shell companies in the last year. Each sale went through with minimal public notice and no competitive bidding. That's not unusual in small cities. It happens all the time, and it's not always corrupt. But combined with a planted weapon, a private security firm running surveillance, and a political campaign built on vilifying the one organization that stands between the developer and the most valuable parcel on Henderson Avenue. "It's a machine," Duke said from his position near the bar. "The whole thing is a machine. Graves builds the political cover. Felt clears the property path. Ashcroft provides the muscle and the frame job, and the writers get destroyed in the crossfire." Silence. Roach stopped bouncing his leg. "So what do we do? Go to the press? Dump all of this?" "With what?" Coyote cut in, his fresh cigarette still unlit between his fingers. "A forensic accountant's spreadsheet and a 13-year-old witness? The press will run with the biker angle first and the corruption angle never. We go public too early, Graves buries the evidence. Felt resigns quietly with a pension, and we're still the bad guys. Coyote's right, John said. He leaned both hands on the plywood table and stared at the photographs. Traffic cam stills showing the black SUV on Henderson, time-stamped across 3 weeks. We need the second gun. If we find it before they execute the raid, we have proof of a pattern. 2 planted weapons. Same source. Same operation. That's not circumstantial. That's conspiracy. And if we don't find it, Roach asked. John didn't answer. He didn't need to. Everyone in the room understood what would happen if a raid team found a stolen police weapon on Iron Ridge property. The arrest would come first, then the headlines, then the court of public opinion, which had already been primed by months of Graves' campaign rhetoric. By the time the truth surfaced, if it surfaced at all, the clubhouse would be seized, the members would be scattered, and Henderson Avenue would belong to Graves' development group. There's something else, Wendy said. The room turned to her. She pulled up a new screen on her laptop, a corporate registration document. Ava leaned forward and squinted at the text. Ashcroft Partners was incorporated in Delaware 3 years ago, Wendy said. The registered agent is a law firm in Wilmington that handles formations for out-of-state clients. Standard privacy shield. But every LLC has to list at least one managing member, even if it's another LLC. She tapped the screen. Ashcroft's managing member is an entity called Ridgeline Security Solutions. Ava's blood stopped moving. Ridgeline. The apartment. The apartment on Ridgeline where she'd lived with her mother and Carl. The apartment she'd fled from 23 days ago now. Ridgeline Avenue, Unit 4B, where Carl Redding sat in a recliner every night drinking beer from a can and watching the door with eyes that calculated how much anger he could spend before it left marks. Ridgeline Security Solutions, Wendy continued, was incorporated 14 months ago. Its managing member is listed as Carl M. Redding. The sound that came out of Ava's throat wasn't a word. It was a sound she didn't recognize, something between a gasp and a cry that she swallowed before it could fully form. She pressed her hands against the edge of the table and felt the wood grain dig into her palms. "No," she said. "Ava," John started. "No, that doesn't... Carl is..." She couldn't organize the words. Her brain was doing something it hadn't done in months, cycling through memories at a speed that made her dizzy. Carl in the recliner, Carl throwing the chair, Carl's eyes, Carl's phone, always on his phone, always in the other room, always talking to someone in a voice that was different from the voice he used on her mother. Quieter, more professional, the voice of a man conducting business. "He's a contractor," Ava said. My mom said he does private security work. Freelance." She said, "He does private security work," Wendy confirmed. "Through a company called Ridgeline Security Solutions, which is the managing entity of Ashcroft Partners, which is the firm that owns the SUV that has been surveilling this clubhouse for 3 weeks." The room reconfigured around this information. Ava could feel it happening. The geometry of the situation shifting, walls moving, the floor tilting. The man she'd been running from and the threat she'd been running toward were connected. Had always been connected. The entire architecture of her escape, the storage lot, the clubhouse, the gun, the bikers, wasn't random, wasn't luck, wasn't the chaotic drift of a homeless girl finding shelter where she could. She'd been sleeping behind the building that her stepfather was trying to destroy. "Did he know?" Ava's voice was barely audible. "Did Carl know I was here?" "We don't know that yet," John said. "Did he plant the gun?" "We don't know that either." "He knew where I'd go." Ava's hands were shaking. She pressed them harder against the table. "He knew. When I left the apartment, he didn't come looking for me. My mom didn't call anyone. Nobody filed a missing person report. I know because I checked at the library. I searched my own name online and there was nothing. Nobody was looking." She looked up at John, and the expression on her face was something no one in that room would forget. Not anger, not fear, but the specific devastation of a person realizing that their disappearance was convenient for someone. "He wanted me gone," she said, "because if I was still in the apartment, if I was still around, I might see something, hear something. He was running operations out of that apartment, the phone calls, the late nights, The meetings, he said, were work dinners. It was all this. It was all Graves, and I was in the way. John moved around the table and crouched down in front of her. He didn't touch her, didn't reach for her hands or her shoulders. He just put himself at her eye level, the same thing he'd done at the gas station, the same instinct, lowering himself to meet her where she was. "Listen to me," he said. "This changes things, but it doesn't change the most important thing. You're here, you're safe, and now we know more than we did an hour ago." "He hit my mother," Ava said, and her voice cracked on the last word, the first crack she'd allowed since walking into this building. "He hit her, and she let him because she was too far gone to care, and the whole time he was using our apartment as a base for—" She couldn't finish. The tears came, and she hated them, hated the weakness they represented, hated that 15 men and Wendy Tran were watching her fall apart in a room that smelled like coffee and old leather and cigarette smoke. She pressed her forehead against the table and let the wood take the weight of her head, and cried without sound, the way she'd learned to cry in the apartment on Ridgeline, where making noise meant drawing attention, and drawing attention meant pain. John stayed crouched beside her. He didn't speak. He didn't comfort. He just stayed, the way a wall stays, present, solid, there. After 90 seconds, Ava lifted her head. Her eyes were red but dry. She wiped her face with the sleeve of her hoodie and sat up straight. "Where does he live now?" she asked. "Carl, is he still at the apartment?" "That's not your problem," John said. "It is my problem. My mother is in that apartment." John and Duke exchanged a look. Coyote pushed off the wall and walked to the table for the first time, leaning both hands on the plywood, his unlit cigarette clenched between his teeth. "The girl's right," Coyote said. "If Redding is Ashcroft's managing member and he's running the ground operation for Graves, he's the operational link. He's the one placing the guns. He's the one driving the SUV or directing whoever is. And right now, he thinks nobody knows." "If we move on him," John started. "I'm not saying we move on him. I'm saying the clock just changed." Coyote looked at John with an intensity that bordered on confrontation. "Before tonight, we had a political problem. A real estate play with a frame job attached. Bad but manageable. Now we have an operational enemy who lives in the same city, who is in a domestic relationship with your niece's mother, and who may or may not know that your niece is sleeping in the building he's trying to take down." He paused. "That's not a political problem, John. That's a tactical problem." The word tactical landed in the room like a dropped blade. Ava saw several of the men shift their weight, an unconscious response, a body language that said, "We know what that word means, and we know what comes after it." "No," John said, and the word carried the force of a door slamming. "We are not going tactical. That is exactly what they want. One incident, one confrontation, one raised voice, one broken window. And Graves gets his headline. We play this clean, or we don't play it." "Clean got us Barstow," Coyote said. "Barstow wasn't clean. Barstow was the opposite of clean. Barstow was exactly what happens when we stop thinking and start hitting. And doing nothing is what happens when—" "Enough!" Duke's voice cut through the room like a saw blade through soft wood. Both men stopped. "John's right about tactics. Coyote's right about the clock. Wendy, how long to build a financial trail that connects Graves to the gun plant through Ashcroft and Ridgeline?" Wendy looked at her spreadsheets. "With what I have now, I can establish the corporate chain in 48 hours. But corporate chain isn't proof of criminal intent. I need transaction records, payments from Graves entities to Ashcroft for specific services. If I can find a payment that correlates with the timeline of the gun plant, a disbursement in the days before the weapon appeared, that's your smoking gun." She paused, figuratively speaking. "Can you get those records?" "Not legally." The silence that followed was loaded with implications that Ava was too young to fully understand but old enough to feel. Wendy was being asked, without being asked, whether she would cross a line, and the answer was sitting in the 3 seconds of quiet before she spoke again. "I know someone," Wendy said carefully, "a former colleague who does digital forensic work for insurance companies. She has access to financial databases that are technically public but practically impossible to navigate without specialized tools. I can have her pull transaction histories for all 7 of Graves' LLCs going back 18 months. "Do it," John said. Wendy nodded and opened her laptop fully. Her fingers began moving across the keyboard with the practiced speed of someone who'd spent years chasing money through digital corridors. Ava sat at the table and felt the room moving around her. Not physically, but structurally, like a building being retrofitted while people were still inside. Every new piece of information added weight. Every connection revealed made the architecture more complex and more dangerous. Her stepfather. Her stepfather was the operational arm of the conspiracy to destroy the Iron Ridge Riders. The man who'd sat across from her at dinner, the few dinners there were in the early days before Carl stopped pretending to be anything other than what he was, had been surveilling, planning, and executing a campaign to frame the one organization that had shown her kindness. The irony was so savage it felt like a physical wound. "Ava!" John's voice pulled her back. He was standing by the front window, looking through the frosted glass at the street outside. The first gray light of dawn was beginning to show at the edges of the sky. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer." She waited. "Carla is going to want to interview you formally, not a casual conversation like yesterday. A recorded statement, on the record. Once that happens, your name enters a system. CPS gets notified. Your mother's address gets flagged. Carl Redding's name comes up in connection with a missing minor." He turned from the window and looked at her. "Once that happens, Carl will know you're here. There's no way around it. The system leaks. It always leaks. And when he finds out his stepdaughter, the girl he was happy to lose, is living in the building he's been paid to destroy, and that she's the one who found the planted weapon." John didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. "I understand," Ava said. "Do you? Because I need you to understand what you're choosing. Right now, you're invisible. Nobody knows you're here. That's your biggest advantage and your best protection. The moment you go on record, you become visible, and visible means vulnerable." Ava looked at the table, at the photographs, at the traffic cam stills showing the black SUV circling Henderson Avenue like a predator marking territory. She looked at the corporate documents on Wendy's screen, the chain of shell companies connecting Russell Graves to Carl Redding to the gun she'd found behind a dumpster while trying to survive another night. "My dad walked into a convenience store," she said. John's jaw tightened. He knew what could happen. He walked in anyway, because he saw someone in trouble and he couldn't look the other way. She paused. "I'm not my dad. I know that. But I'm not nobody either, and I'm done being invisible." Boy, John looked at her for a long time. The dawn light through the frosted glass caught the gray in his beard and the lines around his eyes, lines that mapped a geography of choices made and consequences absorbed. He was seeing his brother's face and his niece's expression. Ava could tell. The recognition was written across him like weather. "Okay," he said. "I'll call Carla." He pulled out his phone, dialed, waited. The phone rang 6 times, 7, 8. John lowered the phone and looked at the screen. Dialed again. Same result. "She's not answering," he said. Duke set down the glass he'd been holding. "She always answers." "I know." John dialed a 3rd time. Nothing. He opened his text messages and typed quickly, "Call me. Urgent." He set the phone on the table and stared at it. 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes. No response. Coyote stepped forward. "When did you last hear from her?" 1:40 a.m., when she called about the serial number and the Ashcroft connection. That was 5 hours ago." "I know what time it was." Coyote lit his cigarette, finally, and inhaled with the slow deliberation of a man buying himself 3 seconds of thinking time. She was running an off-books investigation into a planted police weapon connected to a gang task force officer. She pulled traffic cam footage, ran plates, and accessed financial records without authorization. If anyone inside the department noticed, "Don't," John said. "John, don't say it." But it was already said. The shape of it hung in the room like the cigarette smoke, visible and acrid and impossible to ignore. Detective Carla Brown, the one law enforcement contact the writers trusted, the one person inside the system who was building their case, was not answering her phone at 6:15 in the morning, 5 hours after making calls that could end careers and trigger internal affairs investigations. Ava felt the ground shift again. Not the slow structural shift of new information being absorbed, but the sudden violent lurch of a floor giving way. The one person who could legitimize their evidence, the one badge that stood between the riders and a frame job, was unreachable. Without Carla, they had no chain of custody for the planted gun. Without Carla, Wendy's financial records were inadmissible. Without Carla, Ava's testimony was just a homeless teenager's word against a political campaign backed by private security money and a complicit city commissioner. Without Carla, they had nothing. John picked up his phone one more time. Not to call Carla. He scrolled through his contacts and stopped on a name Ava couldn't see. "Who are you calling?" Duke asked. "Someone I swore I'd never call again." John pressed the phone to his ear. His face was stone. "But we're past that now." The phone rang twice. A voice answered. Ava could hear it faintly, a man's voice, rough with sleep or something harder than sleep. "It's John Mercer," John said. "I know what time it is. I know what I said last time. I don't care." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried something Ava had never heard in it before. Not fear exactly, but the specific weight of a man who has run out of options and is reaching for the one he swore he'd never touch. "Dennis," he said, "I know about Graves. I know about the shell companies. I know about the guns, and I know you're in the middle of it." The voice on the other end went silent. "You've got one chance," John said. "One. Meet me at the old foundry on River Road. 7 a.m. Come alone, or I go to the FBI with everything I have and you can explain to a federal prosecutor how your property commission sold 4 blocks of Henderson Avenue to a man who planted stolen police weapons on my property." He hung up. The room was absolutely still. Roach had stopped moving entirely. Coyote's cigarette burned forgotten between his fingers. Duke's hands were flat on the bar, his massive frame coiled with a tension that had no outlet. Ava looked at John and saw something she'd only seen once before, in her father's face, the morning he'd left for the night shift and hadn't come home. The face of a man who has decided to walk through a door knowing full well what's on the other side. "You're going alone?" she asked. "No," Duke said before John could answer. "He's not." "He has to," Coyote said, and for the first time his voice carried no confrontation, only the flat pragmatism of a man who understood tactical reality. "If Felt sees a crew, he bolts. If he bolts, we lose the only inside connection to Graves' operation." "And if it's a trap?" Duke asked. "Then it's a trap," John said, "and we deal with it." He looked at Ava. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, Marcus Mercer's eyes in a harder face, held something that might have been an apology or might have been a promise. "Stay in the building," he said. "Don't open the door for anyone except Duke. If Carla calls, tell her everything. If she doesn't call by noon." He stopped, picked up his keys from the table. The metal clinked against the wood with a sound that felt final. "If she doesn't call by noon," Ava said, "what do I do?" John Mercer pulled on his leather cut, adjusted the president's patch, and walked toward the door. He stopped with his hand on the frosted glass and looked back at his brother's daughter. The girl he'd found too late. The girl who'd found him just in time. The girl who was sitting at a table in a room full of men who didn't know yet whether they could trust her, but who knew, with absolute certainty, that without her, they were already finished. "If she doesn't call by noon," John said, "you call this number." He set a folded piece of paper on the table. "Who is it?" Ava asked. "FBI field office in Carver City. Agent named Marsh. Tell him everything. Don't leave anything out. Not Carl, not the guns, not Felt, not Barstow. Everything." "John, up. Everything, Ava." He opened the door. The cold October air rushed in, carrying the smell of exhaust and wet pavement and the faint mechanical growl of a city waking up to a morning it didn't know would change everything. John stepped through the door and into the gray light. His boots hit the concrete. His Harley was parked 6 feet away, black and chrome and waiting. And from across Henderson Avenue, sitting in a car that wasn't the black SUV, a different car, a silver sedan that nobody had been watching because nobody knew to watch for it, Carl Redding lowered a pair of binoculars and picked up his phone. He dialed one number. "She's inside," he said, "and Mercer just left alone." The Harley's engine split the morning silence on Henderson Avenue like a blade through frozen cloth. John Mercer pulled onto the road and didn't look back. The cold air hit his face and his hands and the exposed skin at his throat where the collar of his leather cut didn't reach, and for a moment the raw sensation of it, the bite, the sting, the way October wind finds every gap in your armor, was the only thing in his head. Not Dennis Felt, not the planted guns, not his brother's daughter sitting in the clubhouse behind him with a folded piece of paper containing a federal agent's phone number. Just cold, just engine, just the road. It lasted 4 seconds. Then the thinking came back, heavy and relentless, and John leaned into the curve on River Road with the weight of it pressing against his sternum like a fist. The old foundry sat at the edge of Millhaven's industrial district, a sprawling carcass of brick and rusted steel that had been abandoned since the mill closures 15 years ago. The parking lot was cracked asphalt and dead weeds, and when John killed the engine and swung his leg over the seat, the silence that replaced the Harley's growl was so complete it felt like pressure against his eardrums. He was 12 minutes early. He stood beside his bike and scanned the lot. Empty. The foundry's loading dock gaped open like a missing jaw, and beyond it the interior was shadow and the geometric outlines of machinery that hadn't moved in over a decade. John checked his phone. No messages from Carla. No response to his texts. The silence from her end was a sound in itself. The sound of something gone wrong in a direction he couldn't see. He lit a cigarette and waited. At 7:03, a dark blue sedan pulled into the lot from the access road on the north side. It moved slowly, cautiously, the way a car moves when the driver is looking for exits before committing to an entrance. It parked 40 feet from John's bike. The engine cut. For 30 seconds, nothing happened. Then the driver's door opened and Dennis Felt stepped out. He looked older than John remembered, thinner. The military posture that had defined him in Fallujah was still there in the set of his shoulders, but the rest of him had eroded. Hollowed cheeks, deep shadows under pale eyes, a mouth set in the specific line of a man who'd been clenching his jaw for months. He wore a gray overcoat over a dress shirt with no tie, no gloves. His hands were in his coat pockets, and John watched those pockets the way you watch a closed door in a dark hallway. "John," Felt said. "Dennis." They stood 40 feet apart in a dead parking lot with nothing between them but cracked asphalt and 20 years of shared history. The wind moved through the foundry behind them, making the old steel groan. "You said one chance," Felt said. "So here I am." "Here you are." John dropped his cigarette and ground it under his boot. "Start talking." Felt's jaw worked silently for a moment. The look on his face was one John had seen before, in Fallujah, in the moments before a patrol moved through contested terrain. The look of a man calculating whether honesty or silence would keep him alive longer. "I didn't know about the guns," Felt said. "Don't." "I didn't." "John, I swear to you, the property deals were one thing. Graves came to me with a development plan, legitimate investment, jobs, housing, tax revenue, the kind of thing this city needs. I ran the sales through the commission because the numbers made sense. Below market prices, no competitive bidding, through shell companies designed to hide the buyer." Felt flinched. "The pricing was... there were incentives, economic development incentives. It's standard, it's fraud, Dennis, and you know it." John took a step forward, not aggressive, controlled. The movement of a man closing distance because he needs to see the other man's eyes clearly. "You sold city property to a developer who's trying to destroy my club by planting police weapons on our land. You gave him the real estate. Someone else gave him the guns. And right now you're standing in front of me acting like you didn't know, which means either you're lying or you're the dumbest man I ever served with. Pick one." Felt's hands came out of his pockets. Empty. He held them at his sides and John saw them shaking, fine tremors, barely visible, the kind that come from sustained fear rather than cold. "I knew Graves was pressuring the riders," Felt said. "The campaign rhetoric, the public vilification. I knew that was part of the play. Create political will to force the club out, clear the property, move the development forward. I didn't..." "John, I did not know about planted weapons. I did not know about Ashcroft. I did not know about any of that until you said it on the phone an hour ago. You knew about Carl Redding." Felt went still. Ridgeline Security Solutions, John said. Managing entity of Ashcroft Partners. Carl Redding is the operational link between Graves' money and the frame job on my clubhouse. And Carl Redding's home address is the same apartment where my brother's widow and my brother's daughter were living until that daughter ran away because Redding was beating them. Felt's face drained of color. Not slowly. All at once, like someone had pulled a plug. You served with my brother. You knew Marcus. You were at his funeral, Dennis. You stood in the back row in your city commissioner suit, and you shook my hand and you said, "If there's anything I can do," and then you went home and started selling the city out from under the people Marcus died protecting. That's not fair. Fair. John's voice was low and dangerous, carrying a vibration that wasn't volume but density. The compressed force of years of failure and guilt and the specific rage of a man who's watching the walls close in on everyone he's responsible for. My 13-year-old niece is sleeping on a cot in my clubhouse because she's been homeless for 3 weeks. She's been homeless because her mother is an addict, and her stepfather is a man named Carl Redding, and Carl Redding has been too busy planting guns and running surveillance to notice or care that a child disappeared from his apartment. And you enabled all of it. Every property sale, every shell company, every dollar that moved from Graves to Ashcroft to Redding moved because you signed off on it. So don't talk to me about fair. Felt stood in the parking lot with his shaking hands at his sides and his face the color of old paper. And for a long moment, the only sound was the wind through the foundry and the distant hum of morning traffic on River Road. "What do you want?" Felt asked. "Everything. Names, dates, documents, communications, every email, every text, every meeting note between you and Graves, and anyone connected to the Henderson Avenue development. I want the financial records for every property sale your commission approved, and I want you to testify. If I testify, I go to prison. If you don't testify, people I care about lose everything, and prison is the least of what happens to you. Because right now I have a forensic accountant building a paper trail that connects every dollar. And when that trail is complete, it goes to the FBI. You can be the man who cooperated or the man who didn't. Those are your choices." John watched Felt's face and saw the calculations running behind the man's pale eyes. The rapid-fire assessment of damage, exposure, possible exits. He'd seen the same calculations in combat. The moment when a man realizes he's surrounded and starts weighing which direction to run. "There's something you need to know," Felt said quietly. "Then tell me." "Graves has a timeline. The raid on your clubhouse. It was supposed to happen last week. Anonymous tip to the gang task force, coordinated with the officer who reported his weapon stolen. They were going to find the gun, arrest your members, and have the story on every local station by the 6 o'clock news." John's stomach tightened. "What stopped it?" "The gun disappeared. Someone moved it before the tip went in." Graves was furious. He pulled Redding into a meeting at his campaign office, and I was there. I heard him. He said the timeline had been compromised and they needed to accelerate. He ordered Redding to plant the second weapon within 72 hours and execute the raid by end of week. "End of week," John repeated. "That's 2 days from now." "That's 2 days from now." John's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out. A text from Duke. "Call me. Now." He held up a hand to Felt. "Don't move." He dialed Duke. Duke answered before the first ring finished. "John, we've got a problem. Silver sedan's been parked across from the clubhouse since you left. Roach spotted it 20 minutes ago. He ran the plates through a contact at the DMV. And? Registered to Ridgeline Security Solutions." John felt the world narrow to a point. The foundry, the parking lot, Felt's pale face, everything compressed into a single, ice-cold understanding. Carl Redding was at the clubhouse, right now, while John was standing in an empty lot 7 miles away. "Lock it down," John said. "Nobody in, nobody out. Get Ava away from the windows. Call Coyote and tell him to bring everyone he can reach. John, there's more. Roach says the sedan isn't alone anymore. A black SUV pulled up 5 minutes ago, same one Ava described. They're parked on opposite ends of the block. 2 vehicles, bracketing the clubhouse, a containment formation. Is Ava safe?" "She's upstairs. Wendy's with her." Keep it that way. I'm coming back. He hung up and looked at Felt, who had heard enough of the conversation to understand what was happening. The former soldier's face had shifted, the guilt and calculation replaced by something raw, something John recognized from nights in Fallujah when the sound of incoming fire changed the equation from political to physical. Graves moved up the timeline, Felt said. He didn't tell me. Get in your car. Follow me to the clubhouse. You're going to tell my people exactly what you just told me, and then you're going to call the FBI yourself. John, now Dennis? John was on his Harley before Felt reached his sedan. The engine roared to life, and he tore out of the parking lot onto River Road, pushing 70 in a 40 zone, the wind slamming against him with a force that made his eyes water and his teeth ache. Behind him, Felt's sedan struggled to keep up. 7 miles. At this speed, 4 minutes. 4 minutes between where he was and where Ava was, and in those 4 minutes, anything could happen. Carl Redding was parked outside his clubhouse, the man who'd beaten his brother's wife, the man who'd driven his brother's daughter onto the streets, the man who was being paid to plant evidence and execute a frame job that would destroy everything John had built. John's hands tightened on the handlebars until the leather of his gloves creaked. 3 minutes. The buildings on River Road blurred past. Warehouses, mechanic shops, the empty storefront where Marcus used to buy his paperback westerns. John didn't look at it. Couldn't look at it. 2 minutes. He turned it onto 4th Street and ran a red light, the Harley's engine screaming as he downshifted and accelerated through the intersection. A horn blared behind him. He didn't hear it. Didn't hear anything except the blood in his ears and the engine between his legs and the phrase that kept repeating in his head like a metronome. She's inside. She's inside. She's inside. Henderson Avenue appeared ahead. John slowed, not because he wanted to, but because the tactical part of his brain, the part that Fallujah had built and the club had maintained, overrode the panic. If Redding's people were watching the block, a Harley doing 80 would announce his arrival before he could assess the situation. He turned onto Henderson at normal speed and saw it immediately. The silver sedan was gone. The black SUV was gone. The street was empty. Quiet. Morning sunlight touching the brick face of the clubhouse as if nothing had happened. John pulled into the lot and killed the engine. He was off the bike and through the front door in 3 seconds. The scene inside stopped him. Duke stood in the center of the room with blood on his knuckles and a split across his left eyebrow that was bleeding into his eye. Roach was on the floor near the pool table, sitting with his back against the wall, holding his right arm at an angle that suggested it wasn't working correctly. 2 of the younger members, men John knew as Bench and Torquay, were near the bar, both breathing hard, both showing the marks of a fight that had happened fast and dirty. And Coyote was sitting in a chair with his hands zip-tied behind his back. John stared. The information took 2 full seconds to process, and in those 2 seconds the room was silent, except for the sound of heavy breathing and the tick of the coffee machine behind the bar. What happened? John's voice was level, controlled, the voice of a man who has learned that panic kills faster than bullets. Duke wiped the blood from his eye with the back of his hand. 3 men came through the back door 4 minutes after you left. Not through the front. Through the back, the steel door that's never used. They had a key, John. A key to our back door. Who? Redding's people. Private security types, fitted jackets, tactical boots. Same profile Ava described. Where are they now? Gone. They were in and out in 6 minutes. Professional. They weren't here to fight. The fight happened because Roach heard them on the stairs and tried to stop them. John's eyes went to the staircase. The door at the top, the door to the room where Ava was sleeping, was open. Where's Ava? She's fine. Wendy locked the door from inside. They didn't get in. The relief hit John like a wave of nausea. He braced one hand against the table and breathed. They weren't here for the girl, Duke said. They were here for this. He pointed to the plywood-covered pool table. The photographs were scattered, some on the floor. The laptop was gone. Wendy's laptop. The one containing the financial records, the corporate chain analysis, the shell company documentation, every piece of evidence connecting Graves to Ashcroft to the frame job. Gone. They took the laptop, John said. And the printed documents. Everything that was on this table. John turned to Coyote, who was sitting in the chair with his hands zip-tied and an expression on his face that was neither angry nor afraid, but something worse, the expression of a man who has been caught. "Why is Coyote tied up?" John asked. The room went quiet in a way that was different from all the silences before. Heavier, denser, a silence with weight. Duke stepped between John and Coyote, not to block but to establish a physical space for what he was about to say. "The back door key," Duke said. "There are 4 copies. You have one. I have one. One is in the safe behind the bar, and Coyote has one." John looked at Coyote. "The men came through the back door, John. They had a key. They knew exactly where to go. They went straight for the table, straight for the documents. They didn't search. They didn't hesitate. Someone told them exactly what was here and exactly where to find it." "Coyote," John's voice was barely above a whisper. "Tell me this isn't what it looks like." Coyote stared at him. The unlit cigarette was gone. His face was stripped of its usual sardonic armor, and what remained underneath was older and more tired than John had ever seen. "My daughter," Coyote said. The words fell into the room like stones into deep water. "My daughter, John. She's 22. She lives in Carver City. She got into trouble 18 months ago. Debt, bad choices, the kind of hole you can't climb out of. Graves people found her. They paid off her debt, $47,000. And then they came to me and said, 'We own your daughter's future. You work for us, or we bury her.'" John's face didn't move. His body didn't move. But something behind his eyes changed, a light going out or a wall going up, or the specific recalibration that happens when a man who trusts 6 people in the world learns that one of them has been compromised. "How long?" John asked. 4 months. 4 months. John repeated the words like he was testing whether they would break something. "You've been feeding them information for 4 months. Not everything, not the important. You gave them the back door key. You told them about the documents. You told them about Wendy's laptop. They had my daughter, John. And now they have our evidence." The room held its collective breath. Bench and Torque stood by the bar with the frozen posture of men watching a detonation in slow motion. Roach, still on the floor with his damaged arm, looked at Coyote with an expression of bewildered hurt, the expression of a younger man who'd believed in the chain of command and was watching it shatter. Duke stepped forward. "John, we need to decide what happens next, right now. Not tomorrow, not after a vote, not after a meeting. Right now." John looked at the empty table where the evidence had been, at Coyote, zip-tied and diminished, at the blood on Duke's face, at the staircase leading to the room where Ava was. "Wendy," he called. The door at the top of the stairs opened. Wendy appeared, her face tight, her glasses slightly askew. "The laptop," John said. "Tell me you have a backup." Wendy adjusted her glasses. "What kind of forensic accountant do you think I am?" She held up a flash drive, small, silver, the size of a thumb. "Everything, every document, every spreadsheet, every corporate filing, encrypted and backed up before I even opened the laptop in your building." Duke exhaled. Roach let out a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a sob. "There's more," Wendy said. She came down the stairs and Ava followed behind her, moving carefully, holding something in her hand. A phone, Wendy's phone. "When they came through the back door, I started recording audio, 4 minutes and 37 seconds. You can hear them communicating with someone giving instructions. The voice on the other end is on speaker." She looked at John. "The voice giving instructions is Russell Graves." The room absorbed this like a shockwave, not with sound, but with a physical shift in pressure. John looked at the flash drive in Wendy's hand and the phone in Ava's hand and felt something he hadn't felt since the first morning he'd strapped on body armor in Fallujah, the terrifying electric certainty that everything was about to happen at once, and there was no way to slow it down. "Ava," he said, "the number I gave you, the FBI agent." "Agent Marsh," she said, "Carver City Field Office." "Call him, right now. Tell him we have audio evidence of a city council candidate directing a break-in at a private property. Tell him we have financial documentation proving fraud, corruption, and conspiracy to plant police weapons. Tell him we have a witness willing to testify." He looked at Felt, who had come through the front door during Wendy's revelation and was standing just inside the threshold with the expression of a man watching a burning building and realizing he built the fire. "Tell him we have 2 witnesses." Ava looked down at the phone in her hand. The phone that held 4 minutes and 37 seconds of Russell Graves' voice directing the theft of evidence from the Iron Ridge Riders clubhouse. The phone that a 13-year-old girl was holding in fingers that had been homeless 3 weeks ago. She dialed the number on the folded piece of paper. It rang once. "FBI Field Office, Carver City. This is Agent Marsh. My name is Ava Mercer," she said, and her voice did not shake. "I have information about a criminal conspiracy involving a political candidate named Russell Graves, a private security firm planted police weapons, and the attempted destruction of the Iron Ridge Riders Motorcycle Club in Millhaven. I have documentary evidence, audio recordings, and witnesses ready to testify." Silence on the other end. Then, "How old are you?" 13. "Does that matter?" Another pause. "Where are you right now?" "I'm standing in the building they tried to destroy." "Stay there, don't move. Don't let anyone leave. I'm dispatching agents now." A rustling of paper, the sound of a chair being pushed back. "Miss Mercer, is anyone in immediate danger?" Ava looked around the room, at Duke's bleeding face, at Roach's broken arm, at Coyote zip-tied and silent, carrying the weight of a betrayal that had cost him everything except his daughter, at John standing in the center of it all with his brother's eyes and his own scars, and the look of a man who'd been fighting his whole life and had just realized the biggest fight was still ahead. "Yes," she said. "Everyone here." She hung up. The room waited. And then John's phone rang. He looked at the screen. His face changed. Not relief. Something more complicated than relief. Something that contained relief and fear and fury in equal measure. "Carla," he said. He answered, listened. His jaw tightened. His free hand curled into a fist at his side. "Where are you?" he asked. He listened again, closed his eyes. "Are you hurt?" Whatever she said made his knuckles go white. "Stay where you are. FBI's on the way. It's over, Carla. All of it." He lowered the phone. When he opened his eyes, they were bright with something that might have been tears, or might have been the specific moisture of rage, finally finding its channel. "They took her," he said. "Last night. 2 men picked her up outside her apartment after the phone call, drove her to a warehouse in the industrial district, held her for 5 hours, told her if she didn't drop the investigation, her career was over and her daughter's scholarship at State would disappear." "They threatened her kid?" Duke's voice was barely human. "They threatened her kid. They took her phone. They took her notes. And then they drove her to a gas station on Route 9 and left her there without a car." John's voice was flat, controlled, but beneath the control was a tremor that everyone in the room could feel. "She walked 3 miles to a payphone. She's been trying to reach me for 2 hours. Ava stood at the bottom of the staircase, holding a phone that contained evidence, standing in a room that contained wounded men and broken trust, and the scattered debris of a conspiracy that had tried to swallow everything and was now beginning to choke on its own architecture. Outside, the sound of engines. Not Harleys. Multiple vehicles. Moving fast. Duke crossed to the window and looked through the frosted glass. "Black sedans," he said. 3 of them. Federal plates. The FBI had arrived, but so had something else. Behind the federal vehicles, at the far end of Henderson Avenue, a convoy was forming. Pickup trucks, SUVs, motorcycles. The Iron Ridge Riders. Not just the members who'd been in the clubhouse, but others, men and women Ava had never seen, pulling onto the street from side roads and parking lots and driveways. Their engines adding to the growing chorus until the sound was a wall of mechanical thunder that shook the windows of the old brick building. They were coming in. All of them. Not because anyone had called them, not because there was a plan, but because the network that holds a brotherhood together, the calls, the texts, the instinct that tells a rider when something is wrong, had activated, and every member of the Iron Ridge Riders within reach of Millhaven was converging on Henderson Avenue. Ava watched through the frosted glass as the street filled with chrome and leather and the faces of people she'd never met, but who were, in some way she was only beginning to understand, her family. John put his hand on her shoulder. It was the first time he'd touched her. His grip was firm but not heavy, the grip of a man who understood that some things need to be held carefully. "You did this," he said. "We did this," she said. Through the door, the sound of federal agents approaching. Behind them, the sound of the Brotherhood arriving. And above it all, the October wind carrying the first faint warmth of a sun breaking through clouds that had covered Millhaven for days. John Mercer opened the door of the Iron Ridge Riders clubhouse and stepped outside to meet whatever came next, with his brother's daughter beside him, and the weight of every mistake he'd ever made finally, impossibly, beginning to lift. But across the city, in a campaign office with the blinds drawn and the lights off, Russell Graves sat behind his desk with a phone in his hand and a look on his face that wasn't defeat. It was recalculation. The look of a man who had spent his entire career turning losses into leverage, and who was already, even now, even with federal agents on his doorstep, thinking 3 moves ahead. He dialed one last number. The phone rang twice. "It's me," he said. "Plan B. Move the second gun now, not the clubhouse. The girl's mother. Ridgeline Apartment, Unit 4B. He hung up, set the phone down, and smiled. The words came out of Agent Marsh's mouth like a countdown. "We need to move on the Ridgeline Apartment, now." Ava heard them standing in the doorway of the clubhouse, surrounded by federal agents in dark windbreakers, and the slow-gathering mass of Iron Ridge riders filling Henderson Avenue like a tide of chrome and leather. She heard them, and for one terrible second the world went white. Not bright, not illuminated, but blank, the way a screen goes blank when the signal cuts out and there's nothing left but static. Ridgeline. Unit 4B. Her mother. "What did you say?" she whispered. Marsh, mid-40s, square-jawed, buzz-cut, the kind of man who looked like he'd been assembled from a government-issue template, turned to her with an expression that was professionally neutral but couldn't entirely hide the urgency underneath. "We intercepted a communication from Graves's phone 60 seconds ago. He ordered someone to move the second planted weapon to an apartment on Ridgeline Avenue. Unit 4B, is that address significant to you?" Ava couldn't speak. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. The static in her head was too loud. John stepped forward. "That's where her mother lives. With Carl Redding." Marsh's expression shifted. The professional neutrality cracked, and underneath it was the face of a man recalculating everything he thought he understood about this case. "Redding is the Ashcroft operative," John said. "He's Graves' ground man, and the woman in that apartment is my brother's widow. She's not well. Addiction. She won't understand what's happening. If Redding's people show up and plant that weapon, they'll call in the tip and have SWAT through the door before anyone can stop it," Marsh finished. "And whatever they find becomes evidence in a case that buries your club and gives Graves a clean narrative." "My mom," Ava said. The words came out small, stripped of everything. No bravery, no steadiness, no strength. Just a 13-year-old girl saying the 2 words that mattered most. "My mom is in there." Marsh pulled a radio from his belt. "Unit 2, I need an intercept team at Ridgeline Avenue, Apartment 4B, Priority 1. Possible evidence tampering in progress. Suspect may be on site. Civilian present in the unit, female, mid-30s, considered vulnerable. Non-tactical approach. I repeat, non-tactical." The radio crackled back confirmation. Marsh turned to his agents. "Henderson Avenue is secured. I want 2 units here on the clubhouse for evidence preservation. Everyone else, Ridgeline. Move." Federal sedans peeled away from the curb. Ava watched them go and felt her legs moving before her brain gave the order. She was off the curb, across the sidewalk, heading for the street. John caught her arm. "Ava, let go. You can't go there." "She's my mother." Ava turned and looked at him, and whatever John saw in her face made his grip loosen. Not release, but ease. The way you hold something you know you can't keep. "Then I'm going with you," he said. They rode in Duke's truck, John, Ava, and Duke, pushing through morning traffic on streets that felt too ordinary for what was happening. Ava sat in the back seat and pressed her forehead against the cold window and watched Millhaven slide past in a blur of storefronts and traffic lights, and people walking dogs and carrying groceries and living their morning routines while her world contracted to a single point, a door on the fourth floor of a building she'd escaped from 23 days ago. "If he's there," Duke said from the driver's seat, eyes on the road, voice low. "If Redding is in that apartment when we arrive, the feds will handle it," John said. "And if they don't get there first?" John didn't answer. His jaw was set. His hands were on his knees, fingers spread, pressing down as if holding himself in place. They arrived at Ridgeline Avenue 4 minutes later. The building was a 3-story walk-up with peeling yellow paint and a fire escape that looked like it hadn't been inspected in a decade. 2 federal vehicles were already on the street, agents moving toward the entrance with the controlled urgency of people trained to be fast without looking fast. Ava was out of the truck before it fully stopped. She crossed the sidewalk and reached the building's front entrance just as Marsh came through it, one hand on the shoulder of a woman who was wrapped in a gray bathrobe and blinking in the morning light with the specific confusion of someone who'd been woken from a chemical sleep and couldn't process the transition. Ava stopped. Her mother. Diane Mercer, Diane Redding now, technically, though she'd never legally married Carl, looked like a photograph that had been left in the rain. The features were still there. The dark eyes Ava had inherited, the sharp cheekbones, the mouth that used to smile in a way that made Marcus Mercer forget whatever bad day he'd had at the shipyard. But everything around those features had eroded. The skin was sallow, the hair was thin and unwashed. The hands clutching the bathrobe at her throat were trembling with a shake that wasn't cold and wasn't fear, but was the steady, persistent tremor of a body that had been asked to metabolize too many things for too long. "Mom," Ava said. Diane squinted against the sunlight. Her eyes found Ava, and for 3 seconds there was nothing. No recognition, no reaction, just the flat gaze of a woman who had retreated so far inside herself that the outside world reached her on a delay. Then something broke through. A flicker, a crack in the surface. "Ava?" The name came out like a question and an apology at the same time. Diane took a step forward, and Marsh let go of her shoulder, and Ava stood on the sidewalk and felt every wall she'd built over the last year and a half, every brick of invisibility, every layer of numbness, every carefully constructed defense against the pain of being forgotten by the one person who was supposed to remember, tremble. She didn't run to her mother. She didn't collapse. She walked forward slowly and stopped 2 feet away. "Are you okay?" Ava asked. Diane's face crumpled, not dramatically. Not the way faces crumple in movies, with sound and tears and visible emotion. Quietly, like a building settling, like something heavy finally coming to rest. "I'm sorry," Diane whispered. "I'm so sorry. I couldn't." "I know," Ava said. Behind them, Marsh emerged from the building a second time, this time escorting a man in handcuffs. Carl Redding. Ava turned and looked at the man who had made her home a war zone, and felt nothing. Not anger, not satisfaction, not the hot rush of vindication she'd expected. Just the quiet recognition that some people are smaller than the damage they cause. And Carl Redding, wrists cuffed behind him, head down, dressed in sweatpants and a t-shirt, stripped of the fitted jacket and the polished boots and the tactical precision that had made him seem dangerous, was just a man. A small, compromised man who'd traded his humanity for money and was now being loaded into the back of a federal vehicle like cargo. An agent approached Marsh and spoke quietly. Marsh nodded and turned to John, who was standing beside Duke's truck with his arms folded and his face carrying the expression of a man watching dominoes fall. "We found the weapon," Marsh said. "In the apartment, under the bathroom sink. Same profile as the first one. Department-issue Glock, clean bag, deliberate placement, along with a prepaid phone containing text messages from a number we've already traced to Graves' campaign office." "And Graves?" John asked. "Agents picked him up at his campaign headquarters 12 minutes ago. He was destroying documents when they arrived." Marsh's voice carried the particular satisfaction of a federal officer who has just watched a suspect make a critical mistake on camera. "That's obstruction on top of everything else." John nodded slowly. The wind on Ridgeline Avenue was softer than on Henderson, blocked by the buildings on either side, and in the relative stillness, Ava could hear the distant sound of Harleys. The riders on Henderson, still gathered, still waiting, still there. What happens to Carla? John asked. Detective Brown will need to make a formal statement. What happened to her? The abduction, the threats against her daughter. That's federal kidnapping charges on top of the conspiracy. She's a victim and a witness. Her career is intact. Marsh paused. She's the reason I took your niece's call seriously, by the way. Brown and I worked a joint task force case 4 years ago. When she vouched for the riders, I listened. John absorbed this without expression, but Ava, watching him, saw something shift in the set of his shoulders, a fraction of the tension releasing, a load being set down. And Coyote? Duke asked. Marsh looked at Duke. The vice president who was passing information. He'll need to cooperate fully. Given the coercion, the leverage they had on his daughters, there's likely a path to reduce charges or immunity in exchange for testimony. But that's the prosecutor's call. Ava turned back to her mother. Diane was sitting on the building's front step now, bathrobe pulled tight, staring at the sidewalk. A female agent had draped a blanket around her shoulders and was speaking to her in low tones. Ava sat down beside her. The concrete step was cold through her jeans. She didn't care. Mom, she said, you need help, real help. Not the kind where they give you a number to call and then forget about you. Diane didn't look up. I know. Will you go, if I find a place? Diane's hands tightened on the blanket. Her knuckles were white. The tremor in her fingers made the fabric vibrate. I don't know how to do it, Diane said. I don't know how to be... I haven't been... You don't have to know how. You just have to go. Diane finally looked at her daughter. The eyes that met Ava's were Ava's own eyes. The same dark brown, the same shape, but damaged in a way that would take years to repair, if repair was even possible. And yet, underneath the damage, underneath the chemical fog and the guilt and the accumulated weight of every day she'd chosen to disappear instead of fight, there was something still alive. A flicker. Small. Uncertain. But present. Okay, Diane whispered. Okay. Ava put her hand on her mother's arm, not a hug, not a reconciliation, just contact. The first physical touch between them in months, and it carried the weight of everything that couldn't be said, and the promise of everything that might, eventually, be rebuilt. John stood at the curb and watched. He didn't approach, didn't insert himself. He understood, the way soldiers understand, that some moments belong to other people, and the best thing a protector can do is stand close enough to be seen and far enough away to not intrude. Duke leaned against the truck beside him and lit a cigarette. So, Duke said, what now? Now we go home, John said, and we start fixing things. The next 72 hours moved with the mechanical inevitability of a system correcting itself. Marsh's team executed search warrants on Graves' campaign office, Ashcroft Partners' operational headquarters, and Dennis Felt's residence. The documents recovered, combined with Wendy Tran's financial analysis, the audio recording from the clubhouse break-in, and the testimony of Felt himself, who cooperated fully in exchange for a plea arrangement, painted a picture so complete that the federal prosecutor called it one of the most well-documented municipal corruption cases in the district's history. Russell Graves was charged with conspiracy to commit fraud, obstruction of justice, and directing the commission of multiple felonies, including the theft and planting of police weapons. His attorney released a statement calling the charges politically motivated. Nobody believed it. The local news ran the story for 3 consecutive days, and for the first time in the coverage, the Iron Ridge riders were not the villains. They were the target. The community that had been told for months that the bikers on Henderson Avenue were dangerous was now learning that the man who told them that was the most dangerous person in the room. Carl Redding was charged separately. Conspiracy, evidence tampering, domestic violence charges that Diane Mercer Redding finally agreed to pursue, and a federal kidnapping charge connected to the abduction of Detective Carla Brown. He did not make bail. Dennis Felt resigned from the City Property Commission and entered the Federal Witness Protection Program pending trial. His testimony would eventually seal the case against Graves' entire operation, including 3 members of the gang task force who had facilitated the stolen weapon scheme. Coyote, real name Arthur Wren, was released from the zip ties that evening. He sat at the table in the clubhouse with the full membership present and told them everything. His daughter, the debt, the leverage, the 4 months of information he'd passed to Graves' operation, carefully edited to protect the most critical details, but devastating enough to give the enemy access to backdoors and schedules and internal dynamics they should never have had. The room listened. No one spoke until he was finished. Then John asked for a vote. Not on punishment, not on exile, on whether Coyote would be given the chance to earn back what he'd lost. The vote was 11-4. Coyote stayed. But his VP patch was removed and the position was left vacant. Not filled, not replaced, just empty. A visible absence that served as both accountability and possibility. The space would be there when and if it was earned back. Coyote accepted it without argument. He stood up from the table, walked to the bar, poured himself a cup of coffee, and sat in the corner where Wendy Tran had first set up her laptop. He didn't speak for the rest of the evening. But he didn't leave. And in the grammar of the Iron Ridge writers, staying was its own kind of statement. Carla Brown returned to the clubhouse 2 days after the arrests. She walked through the front door with a split lip and bruised wrists she hadn't bothered to conceal, and sat at the bar and drank black coffee and let Duke tell her about the break-in and the fight and the zip ties and Wendy's recording. She got him on tape, Carla said, and something that was almost a smile crossed her damaged face. A forensic accountant with a phone. That's what took down a multi-million-dollar conspiracy. She shook her head. Every time I think I've seen it all. You didn't see this part, Duke said. The kid, Ava. She called the FBI herself, stood in this room and dialed the number and didn't shake. Carla looked at Ava, who was sitting on the stairs reading a paperback she'd borrowed from the library. A Western, one of the same authors her father used to read, chosen not by accident. She shook, Carla said quietly. She just didn't let anyone see it. 3 weeks passed. October gave way to November, and November brought the first frost and the slow dimming of daylight hours and the particular quality of cold that settles into a city and stays until spring. Diane Mercer entered a residential treatment program in Carver City. John paid for it. Not from club funds, just from his own account, money he'd saved from 2 decades of motorcycle repair and the small pension he drew from his military service. He didn't tell Ava about the payment. She found out from Duke, who told her not because John asked him to, but because Duke believed that debts of gratitude should be visible. Ava visited her mother once a week. The visits were short, 30 minutes, sometimes 40, and they were hard in a way that couldn't be described with the usual vocabulary of difficulty. Not painful exactly, not awkward, just heavy. The weight of 2 people sitting across from each other in a clean, well-lit room, trying to rebuild a bridge that had been washed out years ago, 1 plank at a time. The first visit, Diane couldn't stop apologizing. The second visit, Ava asked her to stop. The third visit, they sat in silence for 20 minutes, and the silence was more honest than any conversation they'd had in years. The fourth visit, Diane asked about the bikers, about John, about the clubhouse, and Ava told her. Not everything, not the darkness, not the danger, but the shape of it. The shape of a family that existed not because of blood, but because of choice. The shape of men who wore leather and rode loud machines and carried scars from wars both foreign and domestic, and who had, without hesitation, made room for a girl who had none. Your father would have liked them, Diane said. It was the first true thing she'd said about Marcus in years. The room above the clubhouse became Ava's. Not officially. There were conversations with CPS and a temporary guardianship arrangement that Carla helped facilitate, and paperwork that John signed with the careful attention of a man who understood that this particular signature mattered more than any contract he'd ever put his name on. But practically, functionally, in the way that mattered, the room was hers. She painted the walls herself. A pale blue, the color of early morning sky before the sun commits to full brightness. Duke helped her install shelves. Roach, his arm in a sling for 6 weeks after the break-in, which he treated as a badge of honor and a conversation starter, brought her a desk lamp from a thrift store and a rug that was slightly too big for the floor and had to be folded under at the edges. She enrolled in Mill Haven Middle School. The transition was brutal. 8 weeks of missed classes. Gaps in her knowledge that made her feel exposed in ways that being homeless never had. because at least on the street nobody expected you to know the quadratic formula. But she went. Every morning she walked down the stairs of the clubhouse, past the bar and the pool table and the table with the dark crack in its surface, and out the front door onto Henderson Avenue and caught the bus at the corner. On mornings when John was at the clubhouse, he'd be sitting at the bar with a coffee mug, and he'd nod at her as she passed. Not a big gesture, not a speech, just a nod. The acknowledgement of one person seeing another person and confirming that they are real and present and not invisible. It was enough. The Iron Ridge Riders hosted a neighborhood gathering on the first Saturday of December. It wasn't planned as a celebration. John was clear about that. "We don't celebrate dodging bullets," he told the membership. "We fix the things that let someone aim at us in the first place." But it became a celebration anyway. The way things become what they need to be when enough people are in the same place at the same time, and the relief of survival starts to ferment into something warmer. They set up tables outside the clubhouse on Henderson Avenue, blocking the street with the city's permission. A detail that Ava found quietly remarkable, given that 3 months ago the city had been trying to destroy them. Families from the neighborhood came. The woman from the soup kitchen on Birch Street brought aluminum trays of food. The librarian who used to give Ava looks came and apologized, not with words, but by handing Ava a library card with her name printed on it, Ava M. Mercer. The bikers moved through the crowd with a particular ease, not performing, not displaying, just present. Men who spent most of their lives on the margins of a society that misunderstood them, walking through that society's center and being welcomed. Duke manned a folding table where he was doing free oil checks on anyone's car, a task he performed with the focused intensity of a combat medic, which was what he'd been before he was anything else. Roach, sling finally removed, demonstrated a card trick for a cluster of kids who watched with the wide-eyed attention that only magic and motorcycles can generate. And Coyote stood at the edge of the gathering, leaning against the brick wall of the clubhouse, watching. Not participating, not hiding, just occupying the specific space of a man who was present and distant at the same time, earning his way back inch by inch through the quiet labor of showing up. His daughter had come to see him the week before. Ava had seen them from the upstairs window. Coyote standing in the parking lot, a young woman getting out of a car, the two of them standing apart and then slowly, carefully closing the distance. No embrace. Not yet. But proximity. The willingness to share the same ground. Ava understood that willingness. It was the same thing she brought to the treatment center every Wednesday when she sat across from her mother and let the silence do the work that words couldn't. Late in the afternoon, when the December sun was already dropping toward the rooftops and the temperature was starting to fall, John found Ava sitting on the front step of the clubhouse with a cup of hot chocolate that Roach had made. Too much cocoa powder, not enough milk, absolutely perfect. John sat down beside her. He had his own mug of coffee, black, the same way he'd been drinking it every morning since she'd known him. The steam from both mugs rose into the cold air and tangled together before disappearing. They sat without speaking for a while, watching the street, watching the people, watching the slow, improbable scene of a community gathering around the building that someone had tried to take from them. "You talked to Carla?" John asked. "Yesterday. She said the federal case is moving to grand jury next month." "Graves?" "His lawyers are trying to negotiate. Marsh says it won't work. Too much evidence." John nodded, drank his coffee. "Felt?" Ava asked. "Protective custody. He'll testify. He's terrified, but he'll do it." "Do you feel bad for him?" John considered this. The question deserved consideration. Ava could see him giving it weight, turning it over, not reaching for the easy answer. "I feel bad for the person he was," John said. 20 years ago, in Fallujah, Dennis Felt carried a wounded Marine 300 yards under fire to a medic station. He was the best man I knew in that desert. And then he came home and became the worst version of himself, one decision at a time. He paused. "That's the thing about this life. It's not one big choice that defines you. It's 1,000 small ones. And most people don't notice they've changed until they're too far gone to find the way back." Ava looked at her hot chocolate. The cocoa powder had settled at the bottom of the mug in a dark crescent. "Is that what happened to you?" she asked. "With Barstow?" John was quiet for a long time, long enough that the sun moved a visible distance across the sky. Barstow was my 1001st small choice, he said, the one that made all the others visible. I went there thinking I was protecting someone. I came back knowing I'd failed, and your father looked at me and told me what I already knew, that wanting to protect people isn't enough. You have to know how. You have to do it right, or you become the thing they need protecting from. You're not that, Ava said. Not today, but I was. And the only reason I'm not anymore is because I had people around me who wouldn't let me stay that way. He looked at her. Duke, Carla, this club, and now you. Ava felt the warmth of the hot chocolate in her hands and the cold of the December air on her face and the weight of something she couldn't name settling into her chest. Not pain, not happiness, but something between. The feeling of arriving at a place you didn't know you were traveling to and recognizing it as home. I'm enrolling in the spring semester properly, she said. Full course load. The school counselor says I can catch up by summer if I do extra work. I know, she called me. She called you? I'm your guardian. They call me about everything. The faintest trace of a smile touched the corner of John's mouth, the first time Ava had seen anything close to a smile on his face. You're apparently very opinionated in English class. The teacher assigned a book about a girl lost in the wilderness. I told her I didn't need fiction to understand survival. What did she say? She gave me extra credit. John's almost smile widened by a fraction. He drank his coffee. Ava drank her hot chocolate. The street noise wrapped around them. Conversations, laughter, the low idle of a Harley that someone had started and left running for the warmth of it. John, Ava said. Yeah. My dad. When he walked into that store, do you think he was scared? John looked at the street, at the people, at the bikers moving through the crowd with their cuts and their scars and their earned right to be there. Yeah, he said. I think he was terrified. But he went anyway. He went anyway. Ava nodded. She set her mug on the step and looked at her hands. They were clean now, nails trimmed, no dirt. The hands of a girl who slept in a bed and ate at a table and went to school in the morning and came home at night to a room painted the color of early sky. I'm not going to be invisible anymore, she said. I know, John said. Not for survival, not for safety, not for anything. I know. Good. She picked up her mug and stood. The December wind moved down Henderson Avenue, carrying the smell of exhaust and food and cold air and the faint, persistent scent of leather that would, for the rest of her life, mean the same thing. The smell of people who chose to stand between the world and the ones it forgot. Ava walked down the steps and into the gathering. Someone called her name, a girl from school she'd met 2 weeks ago, standing near the food table, waving. Ava waved back and crossed the street, and the crowd absorbed her. Not swallowing her, not hiding her, but receiving her the way a current receives a boat, carrying her forward. John sat on the step and watched her go. His coffee was cold. He didn't care. He watched his brother's daughter walk into a crowd of people who knew her name, and he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Since before Barstow, since before Marcus, since before the 1,000 small choices that had made him the man he was now, sitting on the steps of a building that had almost been taken from him by a man who thought power was the same thing as strength. It wasn't the same thing. John knew that now. Power was what Russell Graves had wielded. Money, connections, leverage, the ability to move systems and destroy people from behind a desk. Strength was something else. Strength was a 13-year-old girl crossing a street to knock on a stranger's door. Strength was a man buying wool socks for a kid on a curb. Strength was standing still when everything in you wanted to hit something, and choosing to build instead of break. Duke appeared beside him, 2 fresh mugs of coffee in his hands. He sat down on the step and handed one to John without a word. They sat together in the December cold, 2 men who'd been through a war, more than one war, watching the street fill with the sound of people choosing to be in the same place at the same time. Down the block, a Harley engine rumbled to life, then another, then a third. The sound built slowly. Not a roar, not a statement, but a hum, a vibration that moved through the concrete and the brick and the cold air and the bones of everyone standing on Henderson Avenue. The sound of something that had survived, the sound of something that would last.